Warren, if that is your real name. Pleasure to meet you.
As far as I know it is, yeah.
Okay, so you did a talk before to a bunch of journos here, and one of the things that blew my mind about when you're talking about the spy world is that you emphasize the importance of emotional intelligence over intellectual intelligence. So that kind of breaks a lot of the stigma that we find in spy films. In regards to that, would you say that women make better spies than men?
Oh, it's a clear-cut question, but you can't say yes, women are generally or overwhelmingly better. Because women and men, there's a big overlap, we're all human, but a man or a woman often has a different skill set, often coming from instincts, famous women's intuition. And those skill sets as extras when they're applied to the craft of spying often elicit better results or more penetrating insights. So, yeah, it's hard to say yes. Yeah, but when women are good at it, like many blokes are good at spying, when women are good at it, in some circumstances where a man might not have performed that well, a woman sometimes will just shine. She might be a wreck after the whole thing. You say, how did you just sail through that? I mean, you didn't give any hint that you knew what was coming on. Brilliant. And so, well, I've always been able to do that, but it's so draining. And she might go off and go to bed at 3 o'clock and sleep right through till tomorrow morning. But to be able to perform at the time, a woman can often, in some situations, bring a skill set that largely is something most blokes won't be equipped with. But equally, there are times when blokes, a lot of international intercourse between human beings is still significantly male-dominated. And it's changing. Amazing changes in my lifetime. They blow you away. But it's still blokey. Many lines of work, government, in business or whatever, media, are still significantly blokey. So you don't see that many women challenged doing that sort of work. But when you do, women I've known in this area can often be remarkably controlled at a very stressful juncture in some process. And I know some women who are mothers who have gone into it and they say, hey, listen, mate, you blokes don't know this, fathers know something about it, but a mother sleeps with one eye open. A mother never sleeps properly while she's got a baby, and she may have two. And mothers are alert to vibrations, to sounds and all sorts of things during the night. And women, for biological reasons, have many more instincts that are more dormant in blokes.
Well, speaking of females and female spies, we're here to talk about Atomic Blonde. Do you enjoy spy movies?
When I was a teenager, I loved James Bond movies because they were more exciting than other movies. But they're all, very false. And I didn't have to be a full adult to be able to assume that spy's life wouldn't be like James Bond. But Atomic Blonde is a very different generation of spy movie. Firstly, James Bond was always demeaning women by treating them as dolls and playthings, mainly for sex. And if there was a Russian spy, lady spy or something in a James Bond movie, she was awfully clever, but he still got into her knickers, And so Atomic Blonde, there's a lot going on in it. But the biggest thing it does is to highlight how, particularly with Lorraine, as the main character, that she's contending with lots of things happening on different planes all at the same time without even knowing who she can trust, who's working for whom, and is that plane up there linked to this one down here. That's more like what spying's like, which is nothing like the James Bond movies. And you have a woman doing it at an incredibly stressful level in the spying game. And then at the end we find out she's actually a CIA officer, even though she's been in MI6. And she handles all of that to the best of her ability. It's a totally different movie to the old James Bond type things.
So would you say that Atomic Blonde is the film that's gotten the most right?
There are a number of movies and documentaries, like we saw the Spook series on TV, made in England. Lots of the things that are being made nowadays are more realistic. And they often get former spies to help out, and say, if we had a scenario like this, how would you set it up? Who would do what to whom? But, it's all there in Atomic Blonde. And you can't mention Atomic Blonde unless you look at the time it's set. It's just before the downfall of the Soviet Union and before the Berlin Wall came down. It's still the Cold War days. And in the Cold War, many people thought when the Cold War that ran for 40-odd years finished, that we didn't need spies anymore. Well, those 40 years were just an aberrational period, blink of an eyelid, in the 10,000 years of human spying. It's always been going on. And the Cold War in the last century was just a 40-year aberration on top of what spies always do. But the world was split largely into two camps. There was a very small slice of the cheesecake, the non-aligned movement, but it was basically the East and the world, the democratic free world and the communist world. And there were lots of tensions there. That's when I was mainly in it. So I could identify with that, particularly in Berlin at that time. And you've got treachery inside the service she's purportedly working for, MI6. And, lives are at stake. And she handles all of this in her own way. She no sooner digests one thing than, boom, something blows up on another level, and she's got to suddenly swing her attention around to that. And so the movies were very realistic. Always in movies, you get a few extra people are killed and whatnot. It'll be a bit more brutal than the daily life of a spy. But if you look at any spy who's been in it for 10 or 20 years, they'll have come up with a number of scenarios that really tested them, where people got killed and they were lucky to get out alive. So it portrays it. And the biggest thing is it's real and it's nothing like a James Bond movie.
So if this film has an element of realism to it, do you think you could take down a group of assailants using only a hose?
Well, in a movie like that, lots of things are made up. And they're made up for convenience because they fit in. Some may be based on truth and some won't. But, under certain circumstances, I can imagine that.
Is there an element to the spy world that you wish film and television would include to maybe break down a certain stigma about it?
The human side of it. Everything we've been talking about this morning. And John le Carré, who was in MI6, who David Cornwall, everybody knows his real name, his spy novels have always looked at the human psychological side of spying. That's the biggest contribution he's made in all the novels he's written since leaving MI6. And he's sort of in his 80s now. And he deals with that. You read any of his novels and you'll see what's going on psychologically inside the traitor's mind, the spy's mind and whatnot, which is, again, in Atomic Blonde. That's the thing I'd like to see better explained. Now, we're here in Australia as Australians, and down in Canberra there are a lot of nervous Nellies who don't want to talk about these things, don't want to see novels published by former Australian spies on things like this. Oh, we don't want to do that. Good God, in America, former CIA people write books of every possible description. Most of them are screened. They send them into the agency to be screened, and everybody's happy with it. There's a huge genre of novels and movies, but former CIA people talking about this or writing about that. And they accommodate all of that. So a lot of spying in America, it's better known to many Americans, particularly Americans who are interested. But here, you'd think at the end of the world would come if a former spy talked about this or talked about that. Most things that happen in spying, anybody with a brain knows that's what you must do. The people either want money, they're disgruntled, or they need it for a very honourable cause. And there's something unsettling them. That's why they're willing to be recruited by you and pay. It's not as though when spies are trained they become Amazons or superhuman and you have all these Japanese robotic things, artificial intelligence things implanted in your brain or something, and you become a superhuman person with nerves of steel and this plastic mask that's very benign and always smiling. Spies are just human beings. So most people can work out roughly what a spy's life must be like. As soon as you say, well, if you're undercover, you'll do your cover work largely during the day. There might be a dinner you have to go to every now and again, but your spy work will be done largely at night time because the people don't have to be away from their office or whatever. And what they do at night, largely the people they know, even their family, may not be interested in. They just say, I've got to go out with Bill Broggs I went to uni with, passing through town. And at night time, less people are abroad. And if you're a foreigner and a spy in a country where your hair colour, like I had blonde hair until about 20 years ago and it all went this colour, you stand out like hell in a country where everybody has black hair, which is most of Asia. So at night time, it's less dangerous. And you can find places where you can meet and talk confidently without being seen.
So have you ever had to change your appearance for a mission?
Oh, well, disguises have always been there in intelligence. Nowadays, not used that much, but the CIA have been very big on that. They've had some brilliant disguise experts working for them, absolutely brilliant, and they've achieved great things. And they've sometimes had to go into countries when there's a revolution or something on, and say Americans or whoever have been tracked, and they'll go in as a disguise expert, sneak into the country with a false identity, and go and make contact with the people trapped and teach them how to be somebody totally different. They're all part of a film crew, or they're bird experts going to study a migratory pattern that happens in that country. Give them a whole new identity. Papers, passports, visas, everything meticulously done. And then train those people in a matter of days, if they've got the time, or a week, in the cover stories they all have. Get them to live into the real identity they're taking on. And then they sail through the airport and get out. So, God, how do we do that? All because the bloke disguised them. And the disguise experts know, like going through an international airport where you go through immigration, you've got the customs people, there are lots of people looking through CCTV. And disguise experts know the main facial features and the stance of a body or a person. If you've got to portray a person who's 20 years older than yourself or younger, if they were from a very poor part of India, they would have grown up as a child suffering malnutrition, so they'd be relatively small. Lots of Indian people who have come from the country are incredibly small because they've had no real nourishment when they were growing. So if you're going to get someone to take on the identity of an Indian, you've got to make sure you don't get a tall person. But when you go through the system, and airports are full of screening processes, the CCTV, they're using iris identification, facial features and things like that. Disguise people keep up with new technology, and they know the things that a camera will focus on. If someone in the operations room uses his camera to focus on your face when you're coming through the queue streaming from the aircraft down to the immigration counter, a disguised person will know that the first thing that comes up in the technology is the clarity of their eyebrows. Like on women, they can be changed cosmetically every morning, but with men and women, do they naturally come up like this? Like if an Asian woman has eyebrows that come up like that, even if she shaves them off, she'd still put the thin black line close to where the natural line is. Otherwise you can see it. Cosmetics won't cover all that up because it's a feature of the whole face. So a disguise expert knows that if you're going to smuggle someone into or out of a country with a totally false identity, they know which key features to change in the disguise and in the stance. If the person is known to have had a car accident 20 years ago and they never quite got over it, and they had to give up tennis because their shoulder was smashed and reconstructed, then in the disguise, in the new person that's created, they wouldn't carry their shoulder bag on this side, they'd have it on this side. And they may have a limp, but only a very fine one that the people watching will pick out, and other people wouldn't see it, wouldn't come and say, what's wrong with your leg? And so disguise people, the CIA have done some wonderful things in this area that are publicly known. And they know how to get someone through the system and into or out of a country by giving them a totally new identity, which entails a physical change to their facial features and bodily stance. It's not used a lot. It was very much used in the last few thousand years. But since the end of the Cold War, not used much. But when it is, it's got to be brilliant. It's very hard to say because no serving or former spies get to travel around the world's top 50 intelligence services to see how they handle disguises. But I think you'd probably put the Americans and the Brits right up at the top. And the KGB and its successor organisation, they'd be up there too. I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans are further out in front. But again, not used very much these days.
Just quickly and lastly, do you have a favourite pseudonym from your past spy days?
Yeah, the different names I've used, I wouldn't repeat them because
It's classified.
they may still be using them for someone. No, to take on a different identity and be given a whole set of false papers, including like if you present yourself as a classy bloke who's very interested in personal presentation, you're the sort of person who might have cufflinks. I mean, I never wear cufflinks, I can't stand them, but you might have cufflinks with your monogram on them. Or you may still use handkerchiefs that have your initials in one corner. And when you go to your bespoke tailor, they always put in your name and that across the pocket. That sort of thing. If you take on that identity, you'll be a finicky sort of person, the sort of person who go like that, can see a bit of fleck on their shoulder that no one else would see. So, it comes right down to mannerisms and clothing and things like that. And you've got a whole set of false papers and everything that go with it. So you're not only living into the name, you're living into the whole existence of that person, whether they really have ever lived and do still exist or they're totally made up. And it's quite an exhilarating thing. It's incredibly detailed. If you're likely to be called in for a body search, or if things don't go the way you want, you may actually be called in by the authorities to be questioned. And, you'll take your jacket off. And if you're known to be a fancy dresser, they'll be watching. You won't see that they're intently watching that. But when you take your jacket off, all of their eyes will go to here to see whether you use a bespoke tailor and have you got your name there, because it would fit in with your image. So to slip into the role of a totally different person to yourself and have to think about everything, it's just like an actor on the stage. I've never been a stage actor, but I would assume they slip into the character role. And a lot of people now in biographical movies, like Nelson Mandela or Maggie Thatcher or something like that, Winston Churchill, they take on all the mannerisms. They watch a lot of film and video footage of the person and pick up their idiosyncrasies. And it's just amazing in movies. If you've read a number of biographies on a famous person long dead, and you know what they were like, they had a limp and for what reason. And when an actor portrays that person in a movie, they do it so brilliantly. They take you constantly back to different chapters in the biographies you read of the real person. Disguise in intelligence isn't that far removed from what movie makers do.
Warren Reid, former ACES officer, thank you very much for talking to me.
Pleasure.